Thank you very much for joining us for this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and we have an awesome guest with us tonight, folks, Stanton Friedman. Mr. Friedman is a nuclear physicist with both bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Chicago. A true icon of scientific ufology and one of the pioneers of the disclosure movement. He has worked on classified fission and fusion nuclear propulsion systems designed for space exploration with companies such as General Electric, General Motors, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet, General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas, working with highly advanced and classified programs such as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and various compact nuclear power plants for space and terrestrial applications. Stanton has lectured at more than 600 colleges in 50 states, 9 provinces, and 18 countries. Co-author of the Roswell book, Crash at Corona, author of Top Secret MAJIC, numerous appearances on TV, including the History Channel, the Sci-Fi Channel, as well as hundreds of radio and TV programs. Currently, Stanton makes Interstellar flying saucers in New Brunswick, Canada. If you'd like to order one for yourself and learn more about this amazing technology, go to StantonFriedman.com. Mr. Friedman, it's an honor to have you on the show tonight with us here at the Leak Project. How's it going?
Well, I'm doing fine. No, it's not snowing.
Is it normally snowing this time of year out there?
Well, last year we only had 13 feet of snow, so yeah, normally.
Wow, 13 feet of snow. Okay, well, I grew up in the Rocky Mountains, and we were lucky to get 10 feet out there back in the 90s when I was there, but I don't think we ever hit 13 feet. How cold does it actually get out there in the wintertime?
Oh, it's only been down to 40 below once. And, I've lived here since 1980, so I can handle it. Put on another sweater.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll tell you, being out here in San Antonio now, this is the total opposite side of the spectrum.
Yes.
A warm day out here is 110 degrees, and a cool day is 90, so in the summertime.
We almost never get it up as high as 90.
Have you noticed the weather change out there the past 20 years?
It's hard to tell because each winter especially is different. The first year we were here, it snowed, and then it rained, and then it snowed, and then it rained. The next year it was snow, snow, snow. And there have been variations on that theme, so I've never been able to predict. On the other hand, we have great summers. Any visitors, I do recommend coming in the summer. I live in Fredericton, New Brunswick, capital of the picture province of New Brunswick. And Fredericton has a University of New Brunswick. Great place to raise a family. A small town, 50,000. Not like San Antonio. The whole province only has 750,000 people. A far cry from New Jersey, which I grew up in, which has 8 million people in 8,000 square miles.
Wow.
A little bit more crowded. We have 750,000 and 30,000 square miles, so 40 times different in population density. And I mention that only because it's part of the picture of this whole UFO scene about that people forget to think about. Well, how are the stars and planets distributed away from the Earth? We're accustomed, okay, the nearest star is 4.3 light years away, but there are places just down the street where there are 2 sun-like stars an eighth of a light year apart, more than 30 times closer. So, and also, the world has changed. Not everybody knows that, but do they really think about the fact that if you were to get a good guess today about how many planets there are nearby, 20 years ago, Frank Drake said there might be as many as 8,000 in the galaxy, the Milky Way. Today, a good number would be several billion. And that means that within 100 light years, which is just down the street after all, the galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. So 100 light years is nothing. There are about 10,000 planets. So we used to think, hey, we're the big shots. Ain't nobody else out there, no other planets. Don't worry about it. We're it. Well, now we have to say, well, sorry about that, folks, but we're not as important as we'd like to think we are. And it's much more likely that visitors are coming our way when we recognize how close there are a whole bunch of planets. So, and also, they could have a billion-year head start on us. even 10,000. I mean, just look back to 1900 and look at all the words that we wouldn't have known what the heck you were talking about. DNA, neutrons weren't discovered until 1932, fission, fusion. It's just an enormous computers, space flight, airplane flight, lasers. It's an entirely different world in 120 years. So I was just rereading something that Dr. Edward U. Condon had written. He of the Condon Report at the University of Colorado, which came out in '68, early '69. And he included a statement that there's no chance of anybody visiting here for 10,000 years. Now, talk about arrogance.
Right.
I worked on a study of fusion propulsion for deep space travel back in 1962, and I mention that only because essentially all the energy in the galaxy is produced by nuclear fusion in the stars. There are big ones and small ones, and old ones and new ones, but fusion is the name of the game. We didn't even have a thought about fusion until 1938. So, we know that there's got to be guys out there and gals who are much more advanced than we are. Let's hope they are less destructive of themselves. I get people ask me, well, why would anybody come here anyway? And why don't they land on the White House lawn? As if the President of the United States somehow spoke for 7 billion Earthlings. He doesn't, as far as I know.
Right.
But I would point out to a little thing that happened back in the late 30s, early 40s. We had a world war. And we only killed 50 million of our own kind. 50 million. We destroyed 1,700 cities, bombed the heck out of them all over the place. And since that time, we have exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. 2,000, only 2 on people, thank goodness. But, anybody in the neighborhood would say, hey, better keep an eye on those idiots over on Earth. They're bad guys. And they will be able to bother us because they've joined the fusion club. And we tend to think, I get people saying, well, it would take umpteen light years to get here from any place else. That's about as silly as saying that, well, the minimum time it takes you to go around the Earth, Magellan set the record, took 3 years for his ship back in 1522. Well, the space station goes around in like 95 minutes. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. So we need a different set of perspectives. I'm working on a new book, and with Kathleen Marden, we've done captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, and science was wrong. And when I look at some of the comments made by guys with piled higher and deeper degrees, some of them are so absurd because they're totally out of context of reality. Dr. Seth Shostak of the SETI Institute, in his book, Searching for Life Out There, something like that, he said, well, the nearest civilization is probably hundreds of light years away. Based on what? You'd think we'd taken a survey. Hey, guys, go run around and see if you can find life anyplace out there, That's ridiculous. Look, in Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, and Kathleen Marden is Betty's niece, so this is the inside story, if you will. I helped out. We have a star map that Betty saw on board the craft. And a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish did something nobody else had ever done. She built a total of 23 different three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. The base stars, 39 light years away. That's just down the street. That's not the closest, but it's not. I've had big, well-educated people say, well, look how far the next galaxy is. Why would I care about the next galaxy? I mean, if my wife wants a loaf of bread for dinner, I don't say, well, there's a great bakery in Sydney, Australia. I'll be back next week. That's ridiculous. The superstore is less than 2 miles from here.
Right.
So much of the discussion here is pretty silly. And the SETI people, speaking of silly, that silly effort to investigate, some people think it means search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but it doesn't, because it is silly. They totally ignore all the UFO evidence. And they know that surely aliens are trying to send us radio message or laser messages using technology appropriate for us. Where does that crazy idea come from? In the first place, why would they send us a message? In the second place, do we think that nobody's got anything more advanced than us? I don't use a slide rule anymore. I hope everybody knows what a slide rule is. Engineers used to keep one in the shirt pocket and use it all the time back when I started working in industry. But, I mean, the point is that change is the keynote to technology. A laser isn't a better light bulb. It's an entirely different physics situation. So I get disgusted from time to time, and the SETI people, not only do they not reference any of the UFO books, but their assumptions are pretty darn silly. Aliens sending AM or FM.
It's XM now, right? I'm just kidding.
Sure, why not? Well, I've had people suggest that, gee, the nearest civilization might be 500 light years away, and when we make contact, that'll be great, and maybe they'll help us solve our problems. What? One message takes 500 years to get there and another 5 years to get back. Hey, guys, what can we do for you? And that's a pretty silly conversation, don't you think?
Right.
It's strange, the assumptions that pass for science these days.
Well, and let me ask you, as far as these propulsion systems that would make it a lot easier to get from point A to point B if there's a quadrillion miles there, do you think it's going to be some type of wormhole, folding space? Is that your...
No, I'm hipped on nuclear fusion as the starting point.
Okay.
Look, let me describe why I say that. Let's go back a little in time. A big bomb in 1944, in the middle of World War II, released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. It was called a blockbuster, and it took a big B-29 to carry it. And we dropped a lot of them, and they make some pretty big holes in the ground. Okay, that was 1944. Our first atomic bomb, fission bomb, 1945, released the energy of about 16,000 tons of TNT. So from 10 to 16,000, that was fission, nuclear fission. Now, just move forward 8 years, 1952, or 7 years, 1952. First H-bomb, we set it off out in the Pacific, released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. Now, the Russians in 1953 exploded their first H-bomb, and a couple of years later, they exploded a really big one, 57 million tons of TNT. That's how much energy we released. One stinking weapon. And I use that adjective intentionally. But, I mean, look, from 1944 to, say, 1956, and we go from 10 tons of dynamite to 57 million tons of dynamite, and people think we're stuck, that the aliens are stuck at our level? I mean, it's totally absurd. So we need to revise our view of the cosmos, and also take us off the pedestal we've got ourselves on.
Right. Now, and another thing, too, you obviously had firsthand experiences with talking to individuals that were involved with Roswell, correct?
I was the original civilian investigator. Well, I'm still the original civilian investigator, the Roswell incident, yes.
Okay, so when you had the opportunity to, I don't want to talk about this too long, but did you guys find nuclear residue out there close to the crash? Or
no.
Okay.
Well, remember, I wasn't there. The craft was crashed in 1947, early July. I started the investigation in 1978.
Okay.
Just because I happened to be at the right place at the right time, and a reporter was late. And I'm so glad that reporter was late. I was at a television station to do 3 interviews to promote my lecture at Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that night. And I did the first 2. The third reporter was nowhere to be found. This is pre-cell phone age. And the station manager can't find her, and he's giving me coffee. He's looking at his watch. He knows he knew the people who brought me to the station from the campus. He knew I had other things to do. And out of the blue, he says, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. Brilliant investigator I am. I said, who's he? Oh, he handled records of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What? A bolt from the blue. What do you know about him? He lives in Houma. That didn't tell me anything. I didn't know where Houma, Louisiana was. I was there later to visit Jesse, as a matter of fact, interview him for a television program. But he's a great guy. We're old ham radio buddies. You ought to talk to him. The reporter showed up. I did the interview. Was busy all day long. The next day I was at the airport early and thought, things went so well yesterday. Maybe I should try to find this Jesse Marcel. Called information. This is pre-internet. I know people have, it's hard to believe that there was a time pre the internet, but there was, believe me. My phone bill was ridiculous. I got his number from information. He told me his story, and people say, why would he talk to you? I thought this was all hush-hush. His name and picture were in newspapers around the world. I didn't know that at the time. I found that out later. So he told me his story. I shared stuff with Bill Moore. Make a long story short, in the next year and a half, we found 62 people in conjunction with Roswell. Another 5 years, another few dozen people. And I'll be in Roswell early July. Invite everybody to come to the annual Roswell UFO Festival.
It's a cool place out there.
You've been there, okay.
Oh, many times, absolutely.
Well, it's a hot place. Don't tell me a cool place.
it's a hot place to go.
Dry. No humidity there. It's desert, So, yeah, I was involved with Roswell. Now, we made a DVD that's got testimony from 27 first-hand witnesses, and I think all but one is deceased. We're talking a long time ago, 1947, so that's not surprising. But, now, that's not the only crash that there's been, and retrieval. There was a brand new book, it came out in January this year, the Aztec UFO incident. That's Aztec, New Mexico, which is up in the Four Corners region, by Scott and Suzanne Ramsey and Dr. Thayer. And they did one heck of a job. They found all kinds of people nobody else had found, spent an enormous amount of time and money. It's on my list. People can look at www.stantonfriedman.com. But there was also a crash in the plains of San Agustin in New Mexico, where the Very Large Array Radio Telescope is, at the very same time as Roswell. I think of it as being probably a mid-air collision, but that's not a little theoretical, but what the heck. And so, there was a crash down in Varginha, Brazil. And don't ask me where this stuff went. It's kind of funny. People ask me questions as if I had a security clearance and access to all the information about all this stuff. Well, I had a clearance for 14 years, and yes, I did work under security and all that sort of stuff, but I certainly haven't had one once I stopped work in industry, and I certainly don't have access to the inside scoop. What's the saucer made of, Stan? I don't know. If I had a piece, I'd get it tested. Believe me, I would.
Sure. Now, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's right.
I was just going to ask you, when you were involved in some of those propulsion system programs, how advanced were they back then?
Well, it's all a question of money. I got interested in UFOs when I was working as a young nuclear physicist for General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department in Cincinnati, Ohio, technically Evendale, which is a suburb. And that's when I read my first book and so forth. That program, that year, 1958, spent $100 million. That was a lot of money in 1958. I suppose it's still a lot of money. But we employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. So we're not talking 6 professors and 20 grad students. There are a lot of academics who seem to think the only place research gets done is in industry, and it all shows up in the fully refereed scientific literature. Well, that's nonsense. Lots of big money. Well, the stealth aircraft, Lockheed, $10 billion over 10 years in secret. No publications in the scientific literature while it was going on at all. And when I worked on nuclear rockets, it was at least $50 million a year. And I just was reading on the internet a story out of Russia about the Rosatom, the Russian Atomic Energy Commission, if you will, talking about nuclear rockets for going to Mars. And they hope to test something within the next couple of years, I guess. And there wasn't one word in the article, these were American publications, about what the Russians had said, that pointed out back in the late 60s, we Americans, I'm a dual citizen, I can complain about both Canada and the United States, fully accredited complainer. But we tested, 3 different groups tested real nuclear rocket engines on the ground. This was at the nuclear test site out in Nevada, not too far from Area 51. And One was Aerojet General, and theirs had a power level. They were based in Sacramento. Power level was 1,000 megawatts, and I'll put that in context in a minute. I was at Westinghouse Astronuclear in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We tested the XE-1 nuclear rocket reactor propulsion system, power level 1,100 megawatts. And the granddaddy was tested by Los Alamos National Laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, 4,400 megawatts. Now, to give you a context for that, Hoover Dam produces 2,000 megawatts, and it's a huge thing if anybody's gone out to Vegas and looked out there. It's very large. These nuclear rocket engines were all less than 8 feet in diameter. And they were all successful tests. One of the best days I had in the industry when we didn't know how long the darn thing would run before the fuel elements came out or something else bad would happen. And we went the full duration that was possible and so forth. And not long thereafter, they canceled the program. So it's a question of, and there was no mention in any of the articles about this Russian program. And some of them wrongly described they had a reactor burning hydrogen. The nice thing about fission propulsion systems, you use hydrogen propellant, which is the lightest element and the most abundant in the universe. So everywhere you're going, there's going to be hydrogen, like it or not. But you don't burn it. You pump it in cold, and it goes through the reactor and comes out hot, very hot. I mean, 4,000 degrees plus is very, very hot. Jet engines only run up to around 2,000 or so. So now, whether there's something in the pipeline, the study of fusion, as I said, was done in '62, and they're getting ready to test a sort of ground test prototype of a fusion power system. They're thinking about it. It's not quite ready to go. And, give them enough dough, and we can go to the stars. That's the point. And another mistake that people make is that it only takes less than a year, just under a year, to get at 1G acceleration to get to the speed of light. And I've checked classrooms on college campuses, and I get a real kick out of this because I give them a multiple choice question. I ask them if they know what 1G represents. 9.8 meters per second squared, which is technically correct, but meaningless to most people. I said, well, in useful units, that's 21 miles per hour per second. So if your car were accelerating at 1G at the end of 3 seconds, it'd be going 63 miles per hour. It's a pretty hot car because it usually takes longer than 3 seconds to get to that speed. But okay, when you get close to the speed of light, people want us to forget about it, the other half of what Einstein said. Not only did he say that the speed of light was a maximum, so to speak, but he also said as you get close to the speed of light, time slows down for things moving that fast, which sounds crazy as heck. But it's true. And we've measured that experimentally and so forth. That big accelerator over in Switzerland there, the particles go 99.999% of the speed of light. And so time slows down if you're going that fast. And, you go out, come back, marry your granddaughter's best friend. It's a different life. So now I'm not saying there aren't other means of, wormholes or whatever, but those are all kind of imaginary. Nuclear fusion is real. Just look at the sky at the sun up there. That's what it's doing. We didn't know that until the late 30s, you understand, but that's beside the point.
Can I jump in real quick on the sun
Sure.
that you just talked about? Because I think it's important right now, because you did bring that up to segue into this question. There's a lot of SOHO images of what looks like these strange anomalies around the sun. And I've seen some before that almost look like these Dyson cubes, and there's like these tunnels or these vortex wormholes connected to the sun, like it was extracting the energy. And I'm sure you've seen the sci-fi movies, even the new the new Stargate series that came out several years ago, the newest version of it, I should say, where they found this million-year-old UFO and they were trying to figure out how to use it, and then it would go through the different stars and harness the energy from what you're talking about, basically, the fusion. So have you seen those pictures, any of them, and do you think that they're legit?
Well, the pictures may be legit. Whether our understanding of them is complete is another story altogether. We often see things that we don't understand. Like I said, the sun itself, fusion. We didn't know about that 500, 400, 300, 200, 100 years ago. 1938 when somebody figured out, and we didn't produce our own fusion event until 1952. So I don't know what's going on up there. And if there's one thing I'm certain of, is that we will be learning more than we already know in almost all areas of technology. And Kathleen Martin and I have written a book called Science Was Wrong. 14 chapters. We each did 7. Each one stimulated by some smart person saying something stupid, like man would never fly, or space travel is utter bilge. That was the British Astronomer Royal in 1956, a year before Sputnik. And there's a whole long list of these things. So there's a long history on planet Earth of smart people saying stupid things because they think we know all there is to know. And that's never been true. Although if these guys had their way, the guys looking at the really new wouldn't have a chance to. There'd be no money and no place to publish and so forth. So that we will be seeing things that we don't understand is to be expected. Unless you presume that we know all there is to know. We smart earthlings, after all. We've had technology for 120 years. Big deal. It's like in biology. You know, what would the word DNA have meant to anybody back 100 years ago? Absolutely nothing. The people who found X-rays, Röntgen, the great scientist, said, that's a hoax. There's no such thing. The guy was wrong. Röntgen was right. But he had a hard time for expressing some crazy idea. And so, you know, you got to learn from history. And I suppose one of the biggest things we learn from history is most people don't want to learn from history.
Right. Yeah.
Do I know how they work for sure? No. I do know that fusion would do the job. Would it be cheap? Heck no. Like I say, if you got the dough, you can go. And it's a lot of dough. But there are loads of highly classified programs that we didn't even know about. Well, a typical one, the Corona spy satellite. And he got the name, really the guy came up with the name from the Corona cigar, honest to God. Not realizing that Corona is the small town in New Mexico where the Roswell incident actually happened. But anyway, the Corona spy satellite, they knew that the U-2 spy aircraft wouldn't last very long. The Russians would be able to shoot it down soon. It only had like 4 years before that happened. So we were working on the Corona, the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, one of the 3 major spy agencies, CIA and the other guys, NSA. We shouldn't talk about them, should we?
Oh, yeah. There's no such agency.
Yeah, that's right. It never says anything. The Corona spy satellite, the first 12 launches around 1960, were failures. Done in secret. Nobody knew about them. And 13 worked and got more data on Soviet military constructions, facilities, whatever you want to call them, than all the U-2 flights that had happened before that. Did we stand up and say, hey, look what we did? No way, Jose. The Corona was flying for many years after that. They had, every so often they'd launch another one. And it was unique. I loved the way they got their data back. They deorbited a film package, actually dumped it out of the rocket, which was going over in orbit, and we caught it with a big fishnet, if you will, in an airplane flying by down over the Pacific. I mean, that sounds weird, but there's no people there, and you get better data that way than if you at that time than if you transmit as you go, so to speak. The resolution of the pictures is not nearly as good as if you use real film. Kodak actually developed a whole new camera for that, and better film, and all the rest of that. But the point is, there was nothing in public about Corona for 30 years.
Right.
We're talking billions of bucks. So there's a lot going on, and especially your academics typically know nothing about that. Well, it's a good example of that. I've had 2 different people, professors, tell me, look, Stan, if Roswell really happened, they'd have had to take half the professors of physics out of the colleges in the country to look at that. And I just laughed, and I said, surely you're joking. I mean, do you realize how many people we have with high-level security clearances working at these national labs, like Los Alamos, like Livermore, like Sandia? It's 3 of the nuclear weapons labs. The total budget for the 3 nuclear weapons labs is bigger than the whole budget for the National Science Foundation on all its projects. Los Alamos employs over 6,000 people. plenty of good guys, and the requirement would be that you have an appropriate security clearance and a need to know. You don't just say, hey, anybody want to figure out what this stuff is? We'll put it out. That's not how things work. So I don't know what all we've learned. I do feel this way. If we really figured out the propulsion system of the flying saucers to the point where we can duplicate it, I think we would and use it for military purposes. The stealth plane was worked on in secret, but once we got one, we used it. We had a war going. I forget which one it was. Plenty of wars around. So, people tell me, oh, the Germans figured out flying saucers. And I say, you're telling me Hitler was such a nice guy he wouldn't use it during the war? Come on.
Well, I mean, yeah, you would think so, obviously. That makes total sense.
Yeah, you spend a lot of dough and things aren't going well, you use your best shot, just like we tested. We set off nuclear weapons. And it ended the war within, just about a week, I guess, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki after that. That was part of the same picture. And the war ended. Saved 1 million lives. But nobody was predicting that, let's say, a month earlier. I know people whose sons were geared toward going to the Pacific right around that time in 1945. And they expected that there would be 1 million casualties if we try to invade Japan. We were planning on invading. I mean, that's the price you pay. And so, the weapons are terrible, yes. But war is terrible. And it's man's behavior we got to worry about. And I'm sure from an alien viewpoint, we're a bunch of idiots. Well, I mean, the military budget this year, just $1 trillion. How many kids died of starvation yesterday?
We live in the twilight zone, it seems like...
That's a good way to put it, yes.
We really do. And you write a lot in some of your books about different documents and evidence that points to UFOs. One in particular that I was hoping you could share with us is the Eisenhower briefing document.
Yeah. Now, it showed up in the mail in a roll of film that went to Jamie Chandray, who was working with Bill Moore, and I put the two of them together because I moved back east here. They were in California. And here's this document, 8 pages, let's say. It's a briefing for President-elect Eisenhower, dated November 23rd or so, 1952. Ike had been elected, but was not yet president until January of 53. And this document states that President Truman had established a group called Operation Majestic 12, and it named the 12 members of the group. And its purpose was to look at the whole UFO scene and talked about Roswell and bodies being recovered and so forth. And, what are they from here? No, maybe from other solar systems entirely. And the question was the document legitimate? And a couple more were found. And so what do we do about this? Well, what I did, I've been to 20 archives. I like to validate. I like to have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. And a good example of how not to do research, Philip Klass, who was a debunker, senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. One of the supporting documents we found at the National Archives, the Library of Congress Manuscript Division in Washington, was a memo from Bobby Cutler, who was Ike's national security advisor, to General Nathan Twining, one of the members of this group, who went on to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force and so forth, and quite a background. Anyway, this memo was found at a government archive, and it's just brief, but it mentions NSC, National Security Council, MJ-12. And is it legitimate or not? Well, Klass knew that it wasn't because it was done in the large pica type. Perhaps I hadn't noticed that. Of course I'd noticed it. It turns out he had never been to the Eisenhower Library, but he challenged me. I will give you $100 each for every genuine memo you can find done in the same size and style type. And there were a bunch of kickers that had to be signed, certain date frame, et cetera, et cetera. And I had 60 days. And I immediately went to my filing cabinet and pulled out 20 documents done in pica type. Pica's the big one, Elite's the small one. And remember, this is pre-computer, dated 1953. And I was going to the Eisenhower Library anyway, so I went. And I quickly picked up 14 documents, copied them, sent him an invoice. He set a limit, unfortunately, of 10 documents that he would pay for. And when I sent this original pile, he thought 2 might be okay. Well, I was just fooling with him, really. So I went to the Eisenhower Library. I got these ones that met all his criteria, sent him a copy. I sent him an invoice for $1,000, maximum of $10, $100 each. He sent me a check, paid me. He had told everybody about challenging me. He told nobody about paying me. And amazingly enough, his papers are at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia. And it's a good archive. It's interesting. 35 boxes of papers. He and I communicated for more than 20 years. There is no Friedman file there. I don't think he wanted anybody to know that he paid me. And as a matter of fact, when I published a copy of his check in my book, Flying Saucers and Science, he screamed bloody murder. He was going to sue me and all that stuff. And I told him, Phil, you sent me a check. I Xeroxed it. I took the check to the bank. They cashed it. I can do whatever I darn please with the Xerox. And he shut up. But, I mean, this isn't research. As it happens, the Eisenhower Library has 250,000 pages of National Security Council material. To generalize from 10, well, all their stuff had to have been done with the pica type. As a matter of fact, there were at least 3 different pica types there. But that's typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. And I've tried to face up to all the arguments against the documents, because I certainly wasn't going to go public unless I thought, they were legitimate. One in particular fact, one of the people on this group of 12, and they named the 13th because one of the original guys, Secretary of Defense Forrestal, had died, was Dr. Donald Howard Menzel, M-E-N-Z-E-L, Harvard University professor of astronomy, who had written 3 anti-UFO books. Now, all these guys were dead when we got the documents, so you can't go to any of them and say, hey, what about this? And I didn't like Menzel when he was alive, a total debunker. But, okay, we got to follow up on it. I found his papers were at Harvard, naturally. I had to get permission from 3 different people to look at them. And I had run across one memo that mentioned that there was a hearing about taking away his security clearance and claiming that he was a threat to national security. I didn't know what the heck that was about, but that was only one of the things I wanted to look at. And discovered, to my total amazement, that he told Jack Kennedy that he had a longer continuous association with the NSA. Yeah, those guys. Of anybody in the country, 30 years, and it included its Navy predecessor. He was in the Navy during the war, and it was head of Communications Unit number 1 in the Naval Reserve at Cambridge for many years after the war. And it turns out he was also a world-class cryptologist. And there's a paper within the last 10 years in a scientific journal, The Cryptologic Contributions of Donald Menzel. Now, nobody knew this. And people say, well, he couldn't lead a double life. Of course he could. I'll give you 3 guys we know did: Burgess, Philby, and McLean. These were 3 Russian spies who just happened to be working in British intelligence. That's leading a double life, because you've got to be really careful what you pass on, that nobody can pinpoint what the source was and all that sort of stuff. So I've been to all these archives, and I try to follow up. Some of the claims are pretty ridiculous. Well, it doesn't have a top secret code number on it. Well, I checked with the archives, and we got loads of top secret documents that don't have top secret code numbers on them. As a matter of fact, I published 2 myself. There are people who say, obviously it's a fraud, because in the memo it says the briefing officer, this briefing for President Eisenhower, was Admiral Hillenkoetter, Roscoe H. Hillenkoetter. Well, he was only a rear admiral. Obviously, the document is a phony. Well, as it turns out, all the military men, and half of the group of 12 were military, 2 Army, 2 Navy, 2 Air Force, interestingly enough, but they used generic ranks for all of them. In other words, you say general, whether it's lieutenant general, major general, brigadier general, etc. And I went to the Eisenhower Library again, and Ike's staff secretary was a brigadier general, Goodpaster. And he kept minutes of the meetings that they had at the White House, what actions needed to be taken, and he'd list the attendees and all that. And he always used generic ranks, even for himself. When he listed attendees, General Goodpaster. When he signed the memos, it was Brigadier General. And I checked with, I mean, I found many of these. It wasn't just one or two. And I checked with two different archivists, and I said, well, there's nothing wrong with that, Stan. They do it all the time. I did that. Generic ranks. Standard practice. And it's funny, the guy who objected had a strong military background. You'd think he would have known better. But what I'm saying is that I've tried to look at every possible glitch, if you will, something about the documents that doesn't fit. Oh, the date format is wrong on one of them. Well, I found one file folder that has an alarm that had 7 date formats in it. This is pre-computers. That depends on who's doing the typing. And so I still haven't found a good argument against the documents, and I'm convinced, as I say in Top Secret Magic, that indeed there are like 4 genuine documents. There are dozens of phony ones. There are dozens of isotopes that aren't fissionable. So what? I'm going to build a reactor, use the one that is. The basketball coach says, yeah, I know most people aren't 7 feet tall. Give me one. You get the midgets. You know? So it's been a bone of contention, and people who should know better are raising objections that make no sense when you've done your homework. And it's funny, a lot of people said, well, Menzel couldn't have led a double life. Not one of them went to Harvard to look at his papers. I mean, it took some work. I had to get written permission from 3 different people to look at his papers, including his wife, who didn't know anything about his classified work. There's another crazy thing. I had people telling me, well, look, Stan, those guys' wives would all have known what they were doing. That's nonsense. I never told my wife anything classified. It would be against the law, for one thing. Could cost me my job, and who knows what she's going to say, where there might be spies around and so forth. You don't talk classified to people who don't have a need to know and an appropriate clearance. It's not that we're all good guys, but they certainly impress on you that, you know, you're going to watch what you're doing.
And obviously, talking certain information to people you care about, that's putting them at risk also in many ways. So
that's right.
That's really smart what you say, and I can definitely appreciate that, and I'm sure our listeners will as well.
Let me give you another example, incidentally. The program to develop nuclear weapons, the Manhattan Project. There was a general, Leslie Groves, who was in charge of that. His wife got a call on August the 5th, 1945, from Groves' office at the Pentagon, telling her he thought she'd be interested in listening to the radio at noon. Okay, so she listened to the radio. There was no television then. This is 1945. And they announced that we had just dropped this incredible new weapon on Hiroshima, and for sure the war in the Pacific would be over shortly. And she thought that's why the officer had told her, because their son was due to be shipped to the Pacific. The last line of the program, this development program to develop nuclear weapons was under the direction of General Leslie Groves. That's when she found out what he'd been doing for the previous 2 years. 2 years. And he was traveling all over. He never told her what he was doing. I mean, that's in a book that he wrote. So, you know, that's not a third-hand story. So there's a real world, and then there's the imaginary world of the debunkers. They do their research by proclamation. I prefer investigation.
Well, and that's good, too, because I've found out through multiple sources that, you know, the majority of, and this is kind of a different topic, but it's a part of the same thing. The majority of the medical industry out there, the information that doctors have and that's taught in schools and universities, is controlled by about 6 corporations. You know, same with the media. 90% of the media is controlled by 6 corporations at the top level. So when you were talking earlier about the different propulsion systems and people that are just supposed to be at the top of their fields, cutting edge, brilliant, yet they're ignorant, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but they're uneducated on parts and forms that could kind of connect the dots and make it very well possible. Yeah. So that's good that you're stepping out of the box there. And have you had a lot of pushback from different communities that, you know, are like the nuclear industries and stuff like that? No.
I've spoken at many sections of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. When I spoke at Los Alamos section of the American Nuclear Society, they had over 500 people and not one negative question. I've spoken at engineering societies of Detroit and Cincinnati and Baltimore. And over 700 lectures. I've had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk. And there was no problem taking care of the
Right.
the ones that were left. Well, a typical example, I'm at State University of New York in Cortland, New York. Guy gets up in the question and answer period, and I don't care who's there. I just first hand up, Guy stands up. I've never heard so much nonsense in one night in my life. Great way to start, And I said, can you be more specific, please? You said that Betty and Barney Hill were taken to Zeta Reticuli and back in 2 hours. Now, that's 39.6 or something light years. And I said, no, sir. What I said was they were taken on board a craft for 2 hours. They didn't go anywhere. Well, you said that, and there were 2 or 3 more. And finally, somebody in the audience said, how about taking some sensible questions? This guy got up and walked out. I said, I'll take your question, but who was that? I'd obviously gotten under his skin. He was a professor of physics. He didn't hear what I had to say. So I haven't had a problem with that. Everybody thinks, you must get a hard time. No, I don't. Well, a good example, I spoke at Gulf Research Labs in Pittsburgh, a management club's dinner and a talk, and the guy interrupted me 3 times. And finally, the boss man said, let him finish. So I finished, and I turned to him. Well, I'm sure one could come to other conclusions than the ones you've come to. I said, well, let me see now. I talked to this audience about 5 large-scale scientific studies, and after each one I asked how many people here had read it. And as I recall, you hadn't read any of them. Is that right? Well, yes. And so, well, that's the difference between us, isn't it? I gave you my conclusions. I gave you the sources of the data that led to those conclusions. I've read them all. You've read none. Whose opinion is worth more? Long silence. So I did the first year I was speaking, way back in 1967. I worried that, somebody would come up with stuff I didn't know anything about that would prove I was full of baloney. It didn't happen. And I don't worry about it anymore. And like I say, I do classrooms from time to time, and sometimes it's funny. Let me give you another example. I mentioned the 1G. I asked this. I said, this is a multiple choice question. After I asked him what the speed of light is, and that's 700 million miles an hour, incidentally. I say, okay, now the real question is, how long does it take at 1G to get close to the speed of light? It's a multiple choice question. 1,000 years, 100 years, 10 years, or 1. How many think it's 1,000? And then how many think it's 100, 10, 1? Very few think it's only 1, which is the right answer. There are many of these well-educated people who think it's 1,000, or 100, or 10. It's 1 lousy year. And the business about the units, how many meters, 9.8 meters per second squared, nobody talks in those terms. Miles per hour. And so they're prevented from seeing the real world by refusing to use units that mean something to everybody. You got to be a member of the club to understand somebody who says 9.8 meters per second squared. What does that mean?
Right.
So I don't have a hard time from these people. I'm not saying they all want to have me speak, but I've spoken to so many. As a matter of fact, it's what really got me going was the enthusiastic response of the professional groups. One of my earliest was the Engineering Society of Detroit. Now, I mean, I buy Japanese cars now, but still, they're not a bunch of little old ladies in tennis shoes. We had 1,008 people for dinner and a talk sold out 3 weeks in advance, and there wasn't one negative question. Now, I had to respect that. I was a young squirt anyway. At that time, what was I, 23 years old? And here are these engineers, professional ones. And so I try to encourage people. Look, the opinion polls show there are more believers than non-believers. I mean, Phil Klass that I mentioned earlier, he had said, the ratio of believers to non-believers is probably 1 to 11. It's more like, 8 to 2, depending on which poll. It could be as low as 6 to 4.
Didn't you also link the perception of people that believe in unidentified flying objects, UFOs, have a higher IQ typically as well?
Well, they're better educated. I don't know about their IQ, but if you look at belief systems, and there was a research and development magazine that did a survey on these things and looked at the education and so forth. And the greater the education, the more likely to believe in flying saucers, strange as that might sound. And the problem here is that, and I tried this out in a class, the professor and I got together, and can we have the kids vote on a couple of questions with their eyes closed, and you count them so that they won't be my bias, but they won't be influenced by the other students in the class. Sure, let's try that. So they did that, and the first question was, How many of you think most people don't believe in flying saucers? 80% of the hands went up. 80% of the hands that went, 80% of students, in other words, agreed that most people don't believe in flying saucers. That group was asked, how many of you do believe in flying saucers? Also 80%. And when I check my audiences at the end of my lecture, I typically ask, how many of you believe that you have seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? And I prefer flying saucer to UFO because all flying saucer to UFOs, very few UFOs are flying saucers.
Right, okay.
All great-grandfathers are men, but not all men are great-grandfathers.
Yeah, okay.
I am one, as it happens. So what I'm saying is, most people believe in UFOs, but when I ask about how many of you had a sighting, 10% of the hands go up. Because I count them. 1, 2, 3, I point, by the time I get over the far side, the hands go up much more vigorously. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? If I'm lucky, it's 10%. 90% don't report what they see. When people come to my table and sign a book and so forth, and they got to tell me their story, why didn't you report it? They'd think I was some kind of a nut. So, I mean, I've had a husband and wife, one of these dinner talks, and afterwards she says, why did you raise your hand when he asked who had seen a flying saucer? Well, I did. Well, you never told me about it. Well, no, we were just married. I thought you'd laugh at me. It's a husband and wife. So fear of ridicule is apparently one of those primary emotional things that concern us. Nobody wants to be laughed at.
It's the conditioning process.
Side, Well, yeah, the nasty, noisy negativists and ancient academics and fossilized physicists and some ignorant newsmen. I mean, one of the dozen or so PhD theses that have been done about UFOs was press coverage of this subject, and the guy, Dr. Herbert Strentz from Iowa, professor, he did this survey, and he found that, can you believe he read 10,000 clippings, newspaper clippings?
Jeez.
I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but
right.
He made scathing remarks about the inadequacy of the press coverage, the failure to cover, talk to the right people, cover the right, an intentional, I'll call it lying, okay? Disinformation, how's that? Let me give you a specific example. The biggest study ever done for the United States Air Force was published in October 1955, and it included a statement by the Secretary of the Air Force in the press release. They didn't release the report. They didn't say who did the work, but they quoted the Secretary of the Air Force. He said, on the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. We found that only 3% of the sightings couldn't be explained, and that's just because there wasn't enough data. I just mixed up the words on it, but that's the essence of it. On the basis of this report, we believe no object such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified if more complete evidence had been available. Well, I had the report. It was sitting in the University of California, Berkeley Library, and I'm a data hound, and that was the Secretary of the Air Force doing the talking. It went on to be Secretary of Defense Donald Quarles. And it turns out, if you look at the report, the percentage of unknowns was not 3%, it was 21.5%. That's not even close. And it was, they found, although you didn't know it from what was in what he said, they found the better the quality of the report, the more likely to be unexplainable. They did a cross-comparison between the unknowns and the knowns. Is there really any difference? Looking at apparent color, size, shape, speed, that sort of thing. They found the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. And the newspaper press release, which I include in the copies of Blue Book Special Report 14, that's the title, the press release didn't give the title of the report, didn't say who did the work or that the work was done at Patel Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. You see, if they'd given the title, surely some reporter would have said, hey, wait a minute, what do you mean 14? What happened to 1 through 13? Well, if the true answer had been given, which it certainly wouldn't have been, they were all classified. So, that's intentional lying, disinforming, whatever you want. And yet, if you look at the nasty, noisy, negativist publications, they never talk about this. Look, my University of Chicago classmate, Carl Sagan, we were in the same classes for 3 years. He has frequently said it's in 2 books, not just one, that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings. That's not supported with any reference, with any statement, with any facts, and it's totally untrue. It was exactly the opposite. The more reliable the sighting, the more interesting, the more likely it was to be listed as unknown. So there's an enormous mythology out there, and I'm trying to change that. Let's lift the laughter curtain is one of my mottos.
You know, and you put together a book in 2011 called UFOs, Real or Imagined, a Scientific Investigation, Haunted Ghosts, and the Paranormal. And that makes me think of a lot of the people that I've talked to that have actually claimed to have been contactees or have been abducted, not once, but more than once, multiple times. And they always seem to have these really cool psychic abilities. And then I've talked to researchers that say these ETs and ghosts come from the same dimension. And then I've talked to other researchers that say people that are astute with psychic abilities have these sixth sense abilities are more likely to be abducted because of those abilities that they have. So what is the book about that you put together?
Okay. Kathleen Marden has done a survey with Denise Stoner, got forms filled out by a lot of abductees and then a control group who hadn't been abducted. And they found that there were certain things that the abductees had in common. One of them is much greater frequency of paranormal events in their lives. Call it psychic phenomena, whatever you want to call it. There were several things that distinguished the people who experiencers from those who hadn't experienced. So it wouldn't be surprising to me. And one of the chapters in our book, Science Was Wrong, this one Kathleen wrote, was about the published papers in scientific journals about the paranormal, telepathy especially, psychic phenomena, all that sort of thing. And there's loads of papers out there. But when you look at the criticisms by the noisy negativists, they never refer to those papers. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up seems to be the hallmark of the debunkers. There are a couple of others. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. Nobody will know the difference, And do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble, and who's going to know the difference anyway? So these are the kind of things you have to worry about. I warn anybody who's going to be out lecturing, you'll find people trying these arguments. But, hey, 11 hecklers and over 700 lectures, that's a very small price to pay.
Yeah, that's pretty good, actually, especially with these type of topics and discussions. So there's a lot of very strange people out there. And,
yes.
So now, how many people would you say you interviewed that were directly involved in Roswell or a flying saucer crash?
Well, many dozens, let's put it that way. There is a DVD out. It's on my list at www.stantonfriedman.com called Recollections of Roswell. And there are 23 people there who had first-hand involvement that we managed to videotape. And there it is. So I've talked to many dozen, I would say, and other experiences, many, many dozen, but certainly about Roswell. There are plenty of people out there, and it's been nice. And there's loads of interest in Roswell, let's face it. At the 50th anniversary celebration in Roswell, 1997, there were over 300 accredited newsmen. Boy, they kept me busy.
I'll bet.
And I recommend to people carry your sunburn lotion because it gets hot down there and it beats right down on you. I got a terrible sunburn there first time I was there.
Right. Well, yeah, coming from Canada, I mean, geez, that's a totally different landscape out there. And one thing, New Mexico really is the land of enchantment. I love it out there. I actually had the opportunity to travel to Dulce, New Mexico last year, and there's the infamous supposed base underground.
There's a conference coming up this year, but I don't know the date.
Huh, in Dulce?
Yeah,
they're very friendly in Dulce. I must tell you, they very nice people. And one thing too that was amazing is I talked to several people, some at the casino and hotel there, at the grocery store. I talked to somebody that didn't want to be named that has a very prestigious and honorable position there in Dulce. And I actually had the opportunity to go up the Archuleta Mesa out there. I got basically escorted up there, and I didn't get an opportunity to make it to the very top because it was getting real steep and rocky, and I was afraid of getting a flat tire, and I didn't have a proper spare. But man, it sure was cool, and I'm going to go back out there again and hopefully, get some video footage at the top and spend the night out there. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because the people that I talked to, every one of them said that they had had some type of experience growing up, not like abduction experiences, but seeing lights and orbs that would. The one person specific talked about how there were these orbs that hovered over him and his sister, different colors, on the Archuleta Mesa many years ago for like half an hour, and then they just kind of disappeared. And it's pretty remarkable, some of the stories you hear from people out there, the locals.
Well, let's face it, New Mexico, I mean, I was in England on a forum, and there was a professor of astronomy, and why would anybody go to New Mexico? There's only sand there, he said. I said, you ever been there? Well, no. I said, well, apparently you're not aware that two of the three nuclear weapons labs in the United States are in New Mexico, that our first atomic bomb was exploded at the Trinity site in New Mexico, that's where we were firing right after the war, all those captured German V-2 rockets, and that Roswell, the base there, the inhabitants of the base were the 509th Bomb Wing. They just happen to be the most elite military group in the entire world. They're the guys who dropped the atomic bombs on Japan in 45 and two more in Operation Crossroads in 46. And they had, I'll call it a stockpile. It wasn't a big stockpile, but they had atomic bombs on base. Everybody had a high-level security clearance, an elite group if there ever was one. So you would expect. One of the things that is outstanding or distressing about Earth is our explosion of nuclear weapons. And that's the place where it started. And the thing is, when there is a nuclear weapon exploded, there is a residue left, usually radioactive, and you can monitor this from the sky. And so you'd certainly expect that aliens would be checking that out, because they got sense enough to realize, if we don't, that you can use fission or fusion to go to the stars. So that's a threat. And I'm presuming every government, whether it's galactic or planetary or national, is concerned about protecting its citizens against a surprise attack. We learned something from Pearl Harbor. You better be ready. You don't know where trouble's going to come from. There's a story that goes with that. In the Army-Navy football game, the program on November 29th, 1941, had a picture of the USS Arizona, this huge battleship. And in the text, it said, nobody's ever sunk a big ship from the sky. And on December 7th, the Japanese planes sank the USS Arizona. 1,100 people went to the bottom. They knew you could sink a ship from the sky. So there's a lesson there. Be careful. Not everybody is at the same level of technology you are. Don't presume. And so what I'm saying is, when you read Robert Salas's book about the unknowns, the unexplained cases, he's the guy who was at the Minuteman missile launch site in Malmstrom Air Force Base.
Okay.
Saucer comes by, and to make a long story short, 10 Minuteman missiles with nuclear warheads on them, down in the pit, so to speak, went offline one after the other when the saucer showed up. That can't happen, but it did. And it's happened other places. So somebody's paying attention. Happened in Russia the other way around. Several missiles went online. Fortunately, the guy in charge was able to turn them off. But what I'm saying, somebody's paying attention. And I can't blame them.
Well, I think one thing even more frightening than the possibility of nuclear war is these just enormous nuclear reactors and facilities that are located next to fault lines and coastal areas like Fukushima, Chernobyl. And man, I mean, just the after effects of Fukushima, I've heard, are comparable to hundreds and possibly thousands of nuclear bombs going off. Is that correct?
Well, no, it depends on how you define that. The total release of radioactivity was considerable, but it's diluted in the ocean. And so there weren't a lot of people, comparatively speaking. The earthquake was and the tidal wave, tsunami, were really what the problem was. Now, I'm not saying the Japanese guys handled it properly. That's a different kind of question, and I would object to how they handled it. But it's just like Chernobyl. When I read, somebody did a detailed study of just what happened leading to Chernobyl, and All I could do was shake my head. Why would anybody? They disconnect the safety systems when they were running a stupid test. You don't do that.
That's
I mean,
insane.
well, it was insane. And so when I saw that, I had wondered what, and the first coverage didn't give you a clue as to what happened here. And is this big part of my concern was was this something that could happen any place? That we got to really worry about all these nuclear power plants. And the answer is no. Somebody did something really stupid. And, I'm sorry about that, but look, 30,000 people got killed in automobile accidents last year in the United States. Maybe it's a little more than that, but anyway, it's a big number. Airplanes crash once in a while. We haven't said, get all those cars off the road, they're killing too many people. We said, wear seatbelts, among a lot of other things that you should do. Check your tires. There's a whole long list of things. Don't drive while drunk. Minor details like that. So the nuclear industry has an incredibly good safety record. Didn't they just have yesterday the report about that German pilot who decided to run his airplane into a mountain and kill, 150 people or so? Terrible thing. But nobody's saying, well, stop all planes from flying.
You are the perfect person to ask this question. I've brought this up on several shows before, so for people that regularly follow the Leak Project, you guys have heard me bring this up. I've got a military-grade Geiger counter that's built into my watch, and I've taken it all. Oh, yeah, right? After Fukushima, I'm like, okay, well, let's find out if these guys are telling the truth on the internet. So I picked this thing up, and I've traveled, like I said, traveled the country extensively, and I've noticed over the past 3 years, I got it in 2013, so I didn't get it until 2 years after Fukushima, but the radiation levels, you would usually hang out around 0.07, 0.08 microsieverts per hour in the San Antonio area. And then on top of that, sorry about that, and then nowadays it's running closer to 0.13, 0.16, so almost double in the San Antonio area. Now, going to different parts of the country, it never really went up much more than, it got up to like 3 times that, 0.24 in Big Bend, Texas. When I got to Devil's Tower, Wyoming, when I actually went next to the tower itself, the levels spiked to 0.6. And when I went outside of the area, they went back down to about 0.05. So, but I've noticed in San Antonio, which was very odd, I couldn't figure that one out, which is 12 times higher. In the air going to Anchorage, Alaska, the levels jumped up to 4.2. So you're talking 60 times the amount when I was in the air. But why do you think that the levels have consistently increased here in southern Texas over the past 3 years?
Well, I can't tell you about why it's happened in Texas. I can tell you this, that the weather affects how much gets washed out of the sky. There's still fallout from nuclear explosions up there, and there's still fallout from, descriptively bad term, from Fukushima. But remember, if you go up in altitude, you're getting space radiation.
Right.
Pilots get a measurable dose. And we live in stuff that we use, sometimes made with radioactive materials. Some materials are naturally radioactive. People are naturally radioactive. You sleep in the same bed with somebody for a year, you get a measurable increase in your radiation exposure. But I better add, there's a process called radiation hormesis, Hormesis. Hormesis applies to many different things, where a small amount of something is beneficial and a large amount is destructive. Look, 2 aspirin will take care of your headache. 40 would probably kill you. So someplace in between, we say we shouldn't take more than this, that, or the other. A higher altitude, Denver, Mile High City, Albuquerque, Mile High City, the radiation levels are higher because you're getting it from space. The atmosphere absorbs most of the particulate radiation. It comes from the sun. It comes from the cosmic rays. I got a Nobel Prize. He was running an experiment back in the early 1900s. They had just found radioactivity and Röntgen with X-rays and all this sort of stuff. So he expected that the closer you get to the ground, the higher the radiation levels will be. And that was true. But then as he went up higher and higher and higher, the radiation levels went up. And he finally figured out, by running a lot of measurements, that this was coming from outside the Earth, which sounds crazy as heck. And it took, I forget, more than 10 years for him to get the Nobel Prize for discovering cosmic rays, because they're there. Whether you like it or not, the Van Allen belts were discovered by accident. We had a radiation detector. It was on a satellite, and son of a gun, what's going on up there? Gee whiz, we don't know everything. That's the message here. We don't know everything. And anybody who thinks we do is wrong, I'll guarantee it. So radiation levels vary. It can depend on the weather, as I say. How clear are the skies? Well, that affects how much cosmic radiation is absorbed by the atmosphere. If it's cloudy all the time, there's less radiation getting through.
Interesting. Okay. And also I've heard that there's a pretty large nuclear waste or storage facility in Carlsbad, New Mexico. And I heard that there was some type of accident a while ago out there where there was some released, or some of the radioactive isotopes and stuff got released.
Well, you do get stuff released from time to time. And also, you remember when they were having soldiers standing there watching the nuclear explosions?
Yeah.
That's pretty darn stupid, frankly.
Right.
So radiation levels vary all over the place depending on a lot of things, and we don't know them all. But certainly the cosmic radiation is when you go to altitude and flying in airplanes and stuff. And astronauts, they measure the radiation levels they get. We know there is some there. But the radiation hormesis, there have been a lot of experiments. There's a whole book by Dr. Lucky. And where bacteria don't grow as well, where there isn't much radiation. You put a radiation source in an enclosed chamber, and the growth rate of the bacteria will go up, not down. Now, there's a point of no return. I'm not saying just dump more in. But,
right. X-Men.
But, that's the way it is. And, okay, I can't fight it. Find out about it.
So what is your relationship with MUFON? I know that Kathleen, you know her well. You've co-authored books with her. Are you affiliated with MUFON in other ways?
Well, I write a monthly column in the MUFON Journal, and I've spoken at more MUFON annual symposia than anybody. We're getting up close to 50 now, I guess, and I have spoken at more of them. There's one every year, and you got to submit a paper, and it's included in the proceedings and all this stuff. So for a while, I was a state section director for New Brunswick, but now I'm the communications guy, and I spoke at last year's MUFON conference in Irvine, California, as a matter of fact. So I'm not a muck-de-muck, but
sure.
I'm active.
Well, the thing I'm wondering about MUFON is there's so many different people from around the globe that have access to that organization. And do you think that the majority of the people that are kind of representing MUFON and such, that talk about some of the more fringe type experiences, such as mantis aliens, reptilian type extraterrestrials and stuff, do you hear a lot about that when you go to these conferences? And if you do, do you feel
not
genuine?
Much when you go to the conferences. I mean, you're aware that there is discussion, and I'm trying to think where it was recently that I heard somebody describing the mantis type creatures. And no, MUFON is not a kooky outfit. And the reason I mention the papers at the conferences, you'll find a substantial fraction of those are presented by people with advanced degrees. This is not a kooky outfit. That doesn't mean there are no kooks in it. But it's probably true that there are kooks in any organization,
Well, and sure, and I'm not even saying that people are kooks that think that way in any shape or form, because Betty and Barney Hill, when they were abducted.
Read our book, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. Drawings, as a matter of fact, that were made by an artist sitting next to Barney as Barney under hypnosis described what they look like. And, I'd say a gray. 2 eyes, slanted, large, practically no nose, mouth, ears, minuscule. Little guys in that case. There are other reports where they're bigger, but and they weren't all identical. The leader was somewhat different from the rest. But I mean, if you were walking down the street, you'd recognize that. Hey, this is somebody different. If you were in New York, you probably wouldn't.
Yeah, you're in Las Vegas. They're doing the next circus event here at the casino.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's incredible. And didn't they say that it was Zeta Reticuli, or that specific constellation that they had pointed to when they were under
Betty saw. She asked the leader where Betty would ask anybody anything. She's a gutsy gal. She was.
That's great.
And she was a social worker, and they get finished with pretty much all of this. They're waiting for Barney to come back, and they take him in another room. And she wanted to know where they were from. So the leader shows her this, I'll call it a model, a map, a three-dimensional kind of thing. And she's looking at it. It's got a whole bunch of points of light, which are supposedly stars, and different kinds of lines, trade routes and occasional expeditions and stuff like that. And she says, well, where are you on the map? He says, do you know where you are? No, I don't know anything about astronomy. Well, how can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at? End of discussion.
Right.
Now, Dr. Benjamin Simon, the psychiatrist who was a world-class expert on what we today call PTSD, then it was shell shock war veterans. He ran a hospital with 3,000 beds for shell shock war veterans after World War II. And there's an Army movie, Let There Be Light, starring Dr. Simon, explaining how he got people, your buddy's head gets blown off next to you. That's not easy to integrate. Why him, not me? It's a difficult situation. And we're getting more people coming back with PTSD now because medical care is such that more of them survive.
Right.
Hellish experiences. Anyway, Dr. Simon asked Betty if she could remember what the map looks like. And she said yes, and he gave her a post-hypnotic suggestion, please draw it later on. And she goes home, she draws it, and it's in the book. And the trouble is, what does it mean? We have no reference system. Well, a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish did something nobody else had done. She built a total of 23 different three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. Her biggest one had 256 stars in it. And she kept eliminating stars because people said, well, that kind won't have planets and this kind won't, et cetera. And finally, she found one pattern that matched angle for angle, line length for line length, and was able to say that the base stars were two stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli in the constellation of Reticulum, which is in the southern sky. So I can't, if I give a lecture above the equator, I can't say, let's go outside and look at Zeta Reticuli. Well, you can't see it. Sorry. Anyway, I was the first to publish about her work, and a very special thing about Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli. They're the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. Next star to the sun is 4.3 light years away. These two stars, are only 39 point something or other light years from here, but from each other, they're only an eighth of a light year apart. So from a planet around one, looking at the other one all day long, it's visible, would you believe? And you could very quickly learn a lot about the planets. I mean, we're learning now from stars 50 light years away. These guys, got next door neighbors. And you'd certainly expect that you're more likely to develop interstellar travel if you got next door neighbors. That only makes sense.
Right.
So, there have been a lot of attacks on the star map work. I met Marjorie. I was referred to her by the head of the Aerophenomena Research Organization. And I was traveling a great deal lecturing, and so I stopped by to see her, and she could ask me questions. And I was the first, as I say, to publish about her work and helped at a MUFON conference to explain some of the things. She was better at talking to astronomers than she was at non-astronomers. So, it's an exciting piece of work. I've never met anybody any more objective than Marjorie, and she'd been a school teacher, member of Mensa. That's the high IQ outfit. She was a member. And she also wound up with a job through somebody I knew at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. She was a technician there for many years. And brilliant woman, and objective as can be. So it's an exciting piece of work. And yes, it is certainly true that our knowledge of the distances has changed, because back then nobody was going anywhere, so we had lousy measurements of the distance. It's hard to measure. But the European Space Agency put up a satellite that measured loads of them from above the atmosphere, thousands and thousands of measurements of distances. So there are slight changes, how far apart things are and so forth. I'm still satisfied that it's a brilliant piece of work. As a matter of fact, in the video, UFOs Are Real, we interviewed Dr. Mitchell, who was head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University, who let her look at the star catalogs. They wouldn't let her take them out, but she could copy down all the numbers. And he testifies in UFOs Are Real as to the accuracy of her work. Now, coming from him, that means something. He had his students check. He wasn't going to stick his neck out for, oh, well, yeah, she does great work without checking anything. So, nice piece of work. And it does show that a person on their own can make a contribution. You don't need a huge computer. And her work was verified by Dr. David Saunders, who was part of the Condon Committee stuff. He had computerized files. She didn't. And he verified the accuracy of her work as well. So nice piece of work. But it forces us to recognize that you don't need to think about them being thousands of light years away or hundreds of light years away. And I expect the closer your nearest neighbor is, the more likely you are to go see him.
Also, when you wrote Crash at Corona, I haven't even heard of that before. And could you give us some tidbits and some gems about that?
Well, that's really the Roswell story. Because Corona, there was already a book out about Roswell, to which I was a contributor, the Roswell Incident by Bill Moore.
So that's the same connection. I thought that might have been something different.
No,
okay.
Same connection. And they loved me in Corona. I was driving through there around the time of the 50th anniversary. And there's an old theater there, and on the marquee it said, "Forget about Roswell, it all happened here."
When you go back out there, can you take like some type of radiation detector to see if there is radiation around the area where the crash took place?
I haven't been out there, where the crash site was for years. So I don't know.
Would it be too late to get a reading on that, or?
Well, it depends on the half-life, but I have no particular, I'm trying to think. I have the feeling I knew somebody who did make measurements with a detector and didn't find anything exciting. We're talking 1947, so who knows?
Sure. Well, you've got just a great website, StantonFriedman.com. You've got access to your books on Amazon. Can you purchase them on your website as well?
Well, of course, and my website has a big advantage over Amazon. You get signatures on everything.
Oh, how cool is that? Yeah, that absolutely makes sense.
And as a matter of fact, the books by Kathleen and I, we use book plates where we both have signed, so that you get both signatures on Captured or on Science Was Wrong. But she has a website too, and we both sign our books. And when we sell at the museum in Roswell, for example, always sign the books.
That's great. And just one thing too, before we close out tonight, with that book about Science Is Wrong, do you talk about certain like health ailments that some people have that are being diagnosed wrong and the alternative to properly treat them?
We do talk about several medical subjects. There were people who fought against giving inoculations for smallpox. You can't stop smallpox. And think of how many people didn't get their shots. So smallpox has been wiped out, pretty much, and it's a good thing. And there are a number of medical stories in there because medicine has had its share of ancient academics and fossilized physicians. Hey, that's a new one.
Nice.
To stand in the way of truth. If I don't know about it, it's not true. Don't you know that?
Right. Well, it was a real honor to have you on the show tonight with us, Stanton.
Okay.
If there's anything we can do for you, please feel free to let us know. And I'm also going to put a link on our YouTube channel to your website so people will have access to it. And
good.
Yeah, and have a fantastic Sunday. I appreciate everything.
And happy time change day.
Yeah.
I hope people have remembered.
Happy time change day. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stanton.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
You take care. Thank you very much for joining us for this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and we have an awesome guest with us tonight, folks, Stanton Friedman. Mr. Friedman is a nuclear physicist with both bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Chicago. A true icon of scientific ufology and one of the pioneers of the disclosure movement. He has worked on classified fission and fusion nuclear propulsion systems designed for space exploration with companies such as General Electric, General Motors, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet, General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas, working with highly advanced and classified programs such as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and various compact nuclear power plants for space and terrestrial applications. Stanton has lectured at more than 600 colleges in 50 states, 9 provinces, and 18 countries. Co-author of the Roswell book, Crash at Corona, author of Top Secret MAJIC, numerous appearances on TV, including the History Channel, the Sci-Fi Channel, as well as hundreds of radio and TV programs. Currently,
Stanton makes Interstellar flying saucers in New Brunswick, Canada. If you'd like to order one for yourself and learn more about this amazing technology, go to StantonFriedman.com. Mr. Friedman, it's an honor to have you on the show tonight with us here at the Leak Project. How's it going?
Well, I'm doing fine. No, it's not snowing.
Is it normally snowing this time of year out there?
Well, last year we only had 13 feet of snow, so yeah, normally.
Wow, 13 feet of snow. Okay, well, I grew up in the Rocky Mountains, and we were lucky to get 10 feet out there back in the 90s when I was there, but I don't think we ever hit 13 feet. How cold does it actually get out there in the wintertime?
Oh, it's only been down to 40 below once. I've lived here since 1980, so I can handle it. Put on another sweater.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll tell you, being out here in San Antonio now, this is the total opposite side of the spectrum.
Yes.
A warm day out here is 110 degrees, and a cool day is 90, so in the summertime.
We almost never get it up as high as 90.
Have you noticed the weather change out there the past 20 years?
It's hard to tell because each winter especially is different. The first year we were here, it snowed, and then it rained, and then it snowed, and then it rained. The next year it was snow, snow, snow. And there have been variations on that theme, so I've never been able to predict. On the other hand, we have great summers. Any visitors, I do recommend coming in the summer. I live in Fredericton, New Brunswick, capital of the picture province of New Brunswick. And Fredericton has a University of New Brunswick. Great place to raise a family. A small town, 50,000. Not like San Antonio. The whole province only has 750,000 people. A far cry from New Jersey, which I grew up in, which has 8 million people in 8,000 square miles.
Wow.
A little bit more crowded. We have 750,000 and 30,000 square miles, so 40 times different in population density. And I mention that only because it's part of the picture of this whole UFO scene about that people forget to think about. Well, how are the stars and planets distributed away from the Earth? We're accustomed. Okay, the nearest star is 4.3 light years away, but there are places just down the street where there are two sun-like stars an eighth of a light year apart, more than 30 times closer. So, and also, the world has changed. Not everybody knows that, but do they really think about the fact that if you were to get a good guess today about how many planets there are nearby, 20 years ago, Frank Drake said there might be as many as 8,000 in the galaxy, the Milky Way. Today, a good number would be several billion. And that means that within 100 light years, which is just down the street after all, the galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. So 100 light years is nothing. There are about 10,000 planets. So we used to think, hey, we're the big shots. Ain't nobody else out there, no other planets. Don't worry about it. We're it. Well, now we have to say, well, sorry about that, folks, but we're not as important as we'd like to think we are. And it's much more likely that visitors are coming our way when we recognize how close there are a whole bunch of planets. So, and also, they could have a billion-year head start on us. Even 10,000. I mean, just look back to 1900 and look at all the words that we wouldn't have known what the heck you were talking about. DNA, neutrons weren't discovered until 1932. Fission, fusion. It's just an enormous computers. Space flight, airplane flight, lasers. It's an entirely different world in 120 years. So, I was just rereading something that Dr. Edward U. Condon had written, he of the Condon Report at the University of Colorado, which came out in 68, early 69. And he included a statement that there's no chance of anybody visiting here for 10,000 years. Now, talk about arrogance.
Right.
I worked on a study of fusion propulsion for deep space travel back in 1962, and I mention that only because essentially all the energy in the galaxy is produced by nuclear fusion in the stars. There are big ones and small ones, and old ones and new ones, but fusion is the name of the game. We didn't even have a thought about fusion until 1938. So We know that there's got to be guys out there and gals who are much more advanced than we are. Let's hope they are less destructive of themselves. I
Right.
get people ask me, well, why would anybody come here anyway? And why don't they land on the White House lawn? As if the President of the United States somehow spoke for 7 billion Earthlings. He doesn't, as far as I know.
Right.
But I would point out to a little thing that happened back in the late 30s, early 40s. We had a world war, and we only killed 50 million of our own kind. 50 million. We destroyed 1,700 cities, bombed the heck out of them all over the place. And since that time, we have exploded 2,000 nuclear weapons. 2,000, only 2 on people, thank goodness. But, anybody in the neighborhood would say, hey, better keep an eye on those idiots over on Earth. They're bad guys, and they will be able to bother us because they've joined the fusion club. And we tend to think, I get people saying, well, it would take umpteen light years to get here from any place else. That's about as silly as saying that, well, the minimum time it takes to go around the Earth, Magellan set the record, took 3 years for his ship back in 1522. Well, the space station goes around in like 95 minutes. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. So we need a different set of perspectives. I'm working on a new book, and with Kathleen Marden, we've done captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, and science was wrong. And when I look at some of the comments made by guys with piled higher and deeper degrees, some of them are so absurd because they're totally out of context of reality. Dr. Seth Shostak of the SETI Institute, in his book, Searching for Life Out There, something like that, he said, well, the nearest civilization is probably hundreds of light years away. Based on what? You'd think we'd taken a survey. Hey, guys, go run around and see if you can find life anyplace out there, That's ridiculous. Look, in Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, and Kathleen Marden is Betty's niece, so this is the inside story, if you will. I helped out. We have a star map that Betty saw on board the craft, and a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish did something nobody else had ever done. She built a total of 23 different three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. The base stars, 39 light years away. That's just down the street. That's not the closest, but it's not. I've had big, well-educated people say, well, look how far the next galaxy is. Why would I care about the next galaxy? I mean, if my wife wants a loaf of bread for dinner, I don't say, well, there's a great bakery in Sydney, Australia. I'll be back next week. That's ridiculous. The superstore is less than 2 miles from here.
Right.
So much of the discussion here is pretty silly. And the SETI people, speaking of silly, that silly effort to investigate, some people think it means search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but it doesn't, because it is silly. They totally ignore all the UFO evidence, and they know that surely aliens are trying to send us radio message or laser messages using technology appropriate for us. Where does that crazy idea come from? In the first place, why would they send us a message? In the second place, do we think that nobody's got anything more advanced than us? I don't use a slide rule anymore. I hope everybody knows what a slide rule is. Engineers used to keep one in the shirt pocket and use it all the time back when I started working in industry. But, I mean, the point is that change is the keynote to technology. A laser isn't a better light bulb. It's an entirely different physics situation. So I get disgusted from time to time, and the SETI people, not only do they not reference any of the UFO books, but their assumptions are pretty darn silly. Aliens sending AM or FM.
It's XM now, right? I'm just kidding.
Sure, why not? Well, I've had people suggest that, gee, the nearest civilization might be 500 light years away, and when we make contact, that'll be great, and maybe they'll help us solve our problems. What? One message takes 500 years to get there and another 5 years to get back. Hey, guys, what can we do for you? And that's a pretty silly conversation, don't you think?
Right.
It's strange, the assumptions that pass for science these days.
Well, and let me ask you, as far as these propulsion systems that would make it a lot easier to get from point A to point B if there's a quadrillion miles there, Do you think it's going to be some type of wormhole folding space? Is that your?
No, I'm hipped on nuclear fusion as the starting point.
Okay.
Look, let me describe why I say that. Let's go back a little in time. A big bomb in 1944, in the middle of World War II, released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. It was called a blockbuster, and it took a big B-29 to carry it. And we dropped a lot of them, and they make some pretty big holes in the ground. Okay, that was 1944. Our first atomic bomb, fission bomb, 1945, released the energy of about 16,000 tons of TNT. So from 10 to 16,000, that was fission, nuclear fission. Now, just move forward 8 years, 1952, or 7 years, 1952. First H-bomb, we set it off out in the Pacific.